What Now, the podcast that would cage fight any other podcast, anytime, any place, if it weren't for a very busy schedule. I'm Alex Andreu. On today's show, Suella Neal, Legionella 1. No sooner have the first handful of asylum seekers been escorted onto the Bibi Stockholm prison barge, in a punchline worthy of Armando Iannucci, they're taken off again after the water is found to be unsafe. And shareable, snackable, electable content. Before he was PM, Rishi Sunak created an online brand. But will the next election be decided on the doorstep or your auntie's Facebook comments? Let's meet the panel. Seth Thévoz is a journalist, historian, and Oh God, What Now regular. Seth, Labour are in trouble with the Electoral Commission after receiving over £500,000 from an unaffiliated group. It's bad news for Starmer, who's trying to outflank Rishi Sunak on transparency. How did this happen?
Welcome to the weird and wacky world of unincorporated associations.
Okay.
This is the kind of organisation which has been described as the most anomalous group of personalities known to British law. And essentially, it is a route for dark money to make its way into British politics. We largely think of it as synonymous with the Tories. They're well known for groups like the Carlton Club, the United and Cecil Club. There was a story just last week about how people who aren't British citizens can't normally donate to parties. They can donate via a company into the unincorporated association, then the money gets doled out around the Tory party. But Labour do it as well. To give you an example, run up to the last election, I think there was 600,000 in funding to the Tories that was identified through this route, 300,000 also to Labour at the same time. Now, this particular case is an interesting one because it's gone through a group called the Barnes and Richmond Labour Club and Institute. It's a little weird because Barnes and Richmond are quite affluent areas, but they're also a completely moribund area for the Labour Party. I mean, there's no logical seat to spend
that's
money
why
on.
they need a club then.
An institute.
They didn't hang out. But no, it's an area that's been a Tory Lib Dem battleground for decades, and so the money is going to Labour nationally. But it is a bit embarrassing for Labour, to put it mildly. One of the attempts a few years ago to try and clamp down on this practice was to try and force these associations to register when they were giving more than 25 grand a year, and quite a few of them don't. And this was a case where they hadn't done that as well. So we found out about it in a way that's rather embarrassing for Labour. The Committee on Standards in Public Life has for a long time been saying they want to clamp down on these organisations entirely. They would like to instead see the loopholes closed on this. The government shows no interest in closing those loopholes.
Our person of the year, Time writer Yasmine Serhan, is back with us. Hello, Yasmine.
Hello.
Your colleague at Time, Philip Elliott, has declared that Donald Trump is spooked and his rivals know it. Will it even matter come the primaries? And if not, why not?
That's a good question. I mean, for context, for those who haven't been able to keep up with all the indictments, because I certainly have. I had to check. Donald Trump is under indictment for 3 separate criminal cases. He's actually potentially facing a 4th this week over his alleged efforts to overturn the election result in Georgia. We all remember that. So naturally, of course, this doesn't look good, not just for his presidential standing, but also for maybe his personal freedom. And I think his opponents, now that there's smelling blood, are proving to be a bit more open to attacking who once, was their fearless leader. And as Philip wrote, we're seeing this with Ron DeSantis, who's, actually came out and finally said that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. It only took a few years, but that's fine. And we're also seeing it with someone like Mike Pence, who, of course, Trump's former vice president. There's no love lost there. So I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, Trump is leading in the polls still. He's still the favorite. He still kind of has the most control over the Republican Party. But as Philip notes in his great piece, which I'd encourage everyone to read, you can see from his social media pronouncements that he sounds more scared and more on the defensive, like he's backed into a corner. The question is, what does someone like Trump do when they're backed into a corner? So it remains to be seen. But I think, if you're someone like Ron DeSantis or a Mike Pence or a Nikki Haley, and you're maybe going to start thinking twice, do I actually need to try to play nice with this guy? Is there anything for me if he happens to win? Or is he actually too far gone? And maybe it's time we just take him out for good.
But at least they're taking the pot shots now.
Yeah.
Which will damage him, I guess, come the actual election.
We're starting to see division. And frankly, he's going to have a lot fewer allies. I mean, who's going to serve in his cabinet if he's fighting everyone? Remains to be seen.
Other people who need pardons? Our guest this week is another fine filly from the noble stable at PoliticsJOE, Ed Campbell. Welcome to the podcast.
Lovely to be here. Never been described as a filly before, but I like it.
Ed, Nadine Dorries, and I could just pause there and let you go. The lingering member for Mid-Bedfordshire has still not resigned. The Standards Commissioner has decided she has not breached the MP's Code of Conduct by failing to turn up to Parliament in over a year. Chris Bryant is trawling ancient parchments to find some way of ousting her. A Sky investigation found her registered MP's office is now a dance studio. She's out of the country, and her daughter is still listed as a paid member of staff. So whatever happens to her, do we need to revisit the mechanism for constituents getting rid of an MP? What sort of system could work, do you think?
Yeah, it's peculiar, isn't it? She's clearly a dreadful MP, but not dreadful enough, I guess. I think, which it's just peculiar. It shows, I suppose.
This is never there, I
yeah,
guess.
I know. And well, maybe it's the absence. Maybe it's like Schrodinger's Nadine Dorries. Maybe she'll come back and be good. We don't know. But I suppose the good chap theory is kind of dead and buried, isn't it? Like the assumption that people in public life will behave appropriately because they are figures in public life. She made a commitment to resign, which I suppose is like, it's a kind of an odd thing to, it's like turkeys voting for Christmas, like turkey. You promised you'd vote for Christmas turkey, and she's refusing to, which they did on her own television show. And I suppose there should be, it's a real shame. I think there's a tendency to turn every kind of political scandal, Westminster scandal, into like a Tory Labour psychodrama and quite Westminsterize it.
Yeah.
But there is like a genuine, almost democratic deficit in that people in Mid-Bedfordshire are currently without functional parliamentary representation. If you imagine you had a really serious issue, if you were, say, a single mother or someone who needed something, say you had a disabled child who needed access for something, or like improvements in your home.
Who do you write
Who do you turn to? And because you're not allowed, or other MPs aren't allowed to assist in other people's constituencies. So I think there is it's a genuine problem. I don't know, do we need to kind of corporatise Parliament? Do we need to have KPIs for MPs? Do we need to have performance reviews, a bonus structure, if you like? if you have X number of surgeries, make X number of speeches, do you get free pints? I don't know. Something I've talked about this on another podcast.
I don't think we should be offering them alcohol.
Not anymore. Maybe not. But I think, well, maybe a novel idea is there is a functioning political party with a really pronounced, but their whole system is they don't come to Parliament, and that's Sinn Féin. So maybe if you don't go to Parliament enough, you are automatically put into the Sinn Féin thing. And imagine trying to win a safe Tory seat as the Sinn Féin candidate. I think we need to go for the stick approach to force these. There's too much. If they're not coming for the free pints and access.
Someone raised Sinn Féin to me before, but the thing is, they never take the oath, so they don't draw the salary, expenses, etc. And they get elected explicitly on a non, going there platform. So I think it's quite different.
Yeah, no, it was largely
no. I mean, something needs to happen, right?
Definitely.
Like give the Speaker the power to refer individual MPs to the Standards Committee at the very least, so they can suspend them for 10 days if they don't turn up. That triggers I don't know. Boats Week is over, thank heaven, after the Ascension Island idea emerged and was dropped in the space of 2 hours. Lee Anderson told asylum seekers to fuck off back to France, then admitted Tories had failed on immigration. A 400 grand Home Office drone crashed into the sea. Crossings topped 100,000 in 5 years, following the highest daily total this year. And deadly bacteria closed the BB Stockholm barge after a grand 4 days. The literal flagship of Rishi Sunak's Stop the Boats policy looks to be listing. This follows an arguably just as unsuccessful Energy Week the week before, and looks to have already derailed NHS Week, which is this week, with Steve Barclay being asked more questions about Legionella than his chosen specialist subject, how terrible Wales and Scotland's health systems are, compared to the paradise that is the English NHS. So what is going on? Is this the political equivalent of masochism? or a Machiavellian attempt to take the sting out of Labour's attacks by government, opening its Mac and flashing the country with all its failures at once, while most people are on holiday and not paying attention. Yasmeen, another week when we have to open this topic with news of migrants drowning while trying to cross. Reports out that the 6 people who lost their lives were from Afghanistan. Does this expose conclusively that inadequate, safe and legal routes lead directly to crossings?
It does, but I think in the way that all the other deaths that we've seen occur in the crossing in this past year and the years prior have. That's what's kind of so frustrating about these news items when they happen, is that, we know exactly what's causing it. We know that these are vulnerable people who are risking their lives to take these very dangerous routes, who are putting their lives in the hands of these smugglers to seek a better life. And to your point, they're coming from Afghanistan. We know what they're probably fleeing. They're probably fleeing the Taliban. I think what's so sad is that, where only a couple of years ago when Kabul was falling, these are probably the kind of people that countries like the UK would seek to help. Unfortunately, the legal routes, the safe and legal routes for Afghans no longer exist the way it does, rightly so, for people coming from Ukraine, of course. But I think that's, and by that I mean rightly so that it exists for Ukrainians, not rightly so that there aren't avenues for people fleeing similar horrors elsewhere. And
it was always quite ludicrous, the Afghan route post-evacuation, right? Because it requires
a lot
you
of problems
to go outside the country to some consulate somewhere else and then go back in the country and wait for someone to say, yes, you can come. I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it?
I'm still in contact with one source that I remember interviewing when Kabul was falling in 2021. He was a Chevening scholar, so I believe he studied in Sussex and was kind of a leader of their alumni group in Afghanistan. And obviously this attracted the wrong kind of attention from the Taliban. And he and his family were, he was petitioning, emailing me and scores of others, ministers in the government, trying to make a case that, he's done a lot for the UK, that he should be able to go with the Chevening scholars, many of whom were thankfully taken out, the current Chevening scholars. He, and as far as I'm aware, last I spoke to him, he, his wife, and his children were never able to make it out of Afghanistan. He could be the very same people that end up making the very perilous decision to go on these boats. And I think, so obviously there's been a lot of response, since then, people rightfully criticizing the fact that there need to be more safe and legal routes. Of course, I think it's easy for both the Tories and Labour to kind of point the finger at the people smugglers and say, they're the problem. They're giving people these dangerous routes, and that's true. They are a problem, but I think you mitigate that problem and you make people less reliant on them when you do provide safe and legal routes. And the fact of the matter is that the UK government hasn't been able to do that. It could have been much worse. I think there were, I'm trying to remember the exact number, but there were, I want to say around 50 others who were saved. So 6 people died. It could have been a lot worse. Yeah. It's not for lack of trying. There were people on the French and UK side who were trying to save people. But the fact of the matter is this is just not sustainable.
Patricia from Bodmin left Nicky Campbell speechless on Friday when she called into Radio 5 Live to say, "It's very tough and I'm sorry there will be deaths, but that we shouldn't let boats land." These views may have always existed in the darker corners of pubs, but what does it mean that people feel they can now call into the BBC and just air them?
The wording is interesting, that these deaths will happen. It's very dehumanizing, and I think what unfortunately what's happened in the narrative around the boats in the UK is that it's been about boats. It's not been about people. It's a lot easier to point the finger and be like, these boats, these invaders are coming in, these physical vessels that are not human, without thinking about the people who are on them, the people who are the vulnerable people, men, women, children. And I think, the government and even just the commentariat have a lot of responsibility, should be taking responsibility for the way that has been allowed to be spoken about. I think, she's echoing the wording that we're hearing from ministers, from our radios, not from wonderful podcasts such as this one, but, this is the conversation we've allowed ourselves to have. Yeah. And I think the more we strip human beings and real lives out of it, the further away it takes us from having a real humane solution.
Yes. stop the desperate people is not as catchy
Right?
a
Yeah,
slogan, is
it's
it?
not. And I think she would struggle to say, look, women and children are going to die, but we can't let the boats come in. I don't think anyone would say that.
Ed, conventional wisdom would suggest that government directing everyone's attention to a complete skip fire over which it is presiding is not smart politics. The Sunday Times, however, has one insider explaining the strategy as taking the fight to areas Labour is vulnerable on, even if government is on shaky ground, helps Tories dictate the debate. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think for the tactics to work, it requires the British electorate to forget who's been in power for 13 years. You're saying these are the problem areas that we want to focus on, but don't ignore it, cause them. Because August is obviously a quiet week for British political journalism. It's a semi-smart play by the Conservatives to say, oh, today is this week, and then dictate the journalism around it. So we have people talking about it's Small Boats Week, Energy Week, now it's Health Week, and that is what's in the papers. And so if people are paying attention to those issues, what's interesting is I'm not sure they'll have a cost of living week. They're not going to have, in that there's a poll in the Mail on Sunday and a list of priorities of of important issues that people that matters to people. 69% of people said cost of living. The next highest one was NHS, which I think had 35% of people said the NHS. 10% said immigration and asylum. 2% said trans rights. So it's a complete distraction tactic from what the Conservatives are actually failing on.
The ONS figures for inflation are coming out on Wednesday, and there was a little scoop in the eye that suggests inflation has gone down by only 0.1%, which is not what they would be hoping, and that it's going to go up next month because of this little bump in spending during June. So I think they're getting a cost of living week, whether they want to or not this week.
But every week should be the cost of living week, which it shouldn't. I think it's kind of ludicrous that it is dictated by government spin. And then also, I suppose, I want to touch on the areas Labour is vulnerable on, because they say they're trying to paint Labour as like as if they're the political wing of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, when really they've probably got as much contempt for them as the Conservatives have. There actually isn't that much difference in terms of policy in a lot of these areas, especially when it comes to kind of they're kind of taking a neutral stance on a lot of small boats. They've talked about they've contextualised this, but they said they wouldn't immediately stop the use of the barges, primarily because you can't do anything overnight. Labour aren't going to come into power and fix the country, but they're trying to make Labour seem a lot more different to them than they actually probably are.
On the BBC Stockholm, Sky's Rob Powell has exposed a really complex timeline, much more than originally thought. Apparently, the results came back on Monday, were first communicated to the Home Office on Tuesday, but somehow ministers apparently didn't find out until Thursday. The health department didn't find out until Friday, which I find extraordinary. Steve Barclay was doing the media rounds on Monday, going, it's not my department. Really? Deadly virus, deadly bacteria is not your department. Does this have the potential to run more, to turn into actually a scandal of who knew what and when?
You kind of hope so. But I think that's maybe having too much faith in the British media and the kind of the discussion around asylum seekers. I think
I don't know. A slow news week can turn quite quickly, can't it?
But if a lot of the media have been presenting these people as they are men of fighting age, etc., and to suddenly pivot from that using dehumanising language, the Home Secretary and lots of Home Secretaries have been using just really horrible language about these people, and to go from parroting those lines and creating kind of a fear of these people as like the bogeyman, to then being we need to look after them. I suppose saying these people should not be exposed to Legionnaire's disease is actually not that.
The bar is really low now.
They kind of tried that on Sunday. They tried to suggest that Well, this just proves what terrific care of them we're taking and how sensitive we are to their needs. That you removed them from deadly bacteria only after 5 days.
None of them have caught it, so it's fine.
As recently as last Sunday, actually, Robert Jenrick was telling the media the barge was perfectly decent accommodation. Steve Barclay, in his Monday media rounds, emphasised that nobody got sick. And migrants were moved off as a precaution, which I love. They keep repeating this phrase. Are we hours away from Lee Anderson saying that back in his day we got legionnaires and never moaned about it?
I think we're about 20 minutes from Lee Anderson and the strangest young Conservative you can find scaling the side of the baby stock. It was led by donkeys scaled Michelle Moan's yacht.
Yes.
It's going to be Lee Anderson licking the baby stock and proving, and then saying we could just plug the gap with the best asbestos or something like that.
It's a niche corner on Pornhub.
Very popular though.
Seth, do you think that Braverman...
What a terrible introduction.
Speaking of Pornhub.
Yes, I read Seth is a niche. Seth, do you think that Braverman is actually quite vulnerable considering just how badly last week went?
I don't think so, and it's partly because of this dehumanisation of migrants in the first place. But also, she may not be the brightest bulb on the tree, but there are plenty of cabinet ministers who you can say are not the brightest bulb on the tree. And Suella Braverman's
Do
great...
trees have bulbs? What's going on with your metaphor?
Christmas time in August. But the problem with Braverman is she does know how to throw red meat to Tory activists. She does know exactly what they want. And actually, the analogies I can think of would be people like Chris Grayling or Grant Shapps. None of these people are thought of as prime ministerial material, but actually they give the Tory rank and file exactly what they want. And unfortunately, I'm going to make a prediction here. I think the next Tory leadership election is most likely to be a runoff between Suella Braverman and Kemi Badenoch.
That's harrowing.
Okay.
I
think that's terrific, personally. I say, I'm thinking along the lines of that Gary Larson cartoon with a dog that has the cat food signs leading into the washing machine, basically.
The trouble is what happens next, because, it's the same line of thought that said, it's great that Donald Trump has won the Republican nomination because he'll never win an election.
Yes. Thank you for that, Seth.
Sorry.
In many ways, Energy Week, the week before, went quite badly too. Greenpeace were frozen out of talking to government for the stunt they pulled on Sunak's house. They said that Rishi Sunak will go down in history. Yay! For failing the UK on climate. Boo! By trying to open that divide on climate, does Sunak risk being out of step with public opinion, actually? Because all the polls seem to show terrific support for. So what's going on?
Firstly, I think it's a good thing at least they didn't try and run another crime week, because if you remember that, it turned out half the government had been breaching lockdown rules that week.
There's time yet. I think there's one more week of recess to come that hasn't been assigned.
But you're right on public opinion. Actually, Ed was touching on this as well. The idea that if you look, for example, at YouGov's issues tracker, something like the environment is actually number 4 on the issue tracker. I think the economy is first, housing is second, and immigration is third. So they've not only managed to pick something that is not even people's main concern, but they have a minority view on something that's a fairly low priority to begin with. So yes, they are trying this whole thing of going for a core vote strategy, but it's not even something that particularly fires up their core.
And there's also so many extreme weather phenomena at the moment all over the news. It's like, every time you turn the telly on, it's like there's a ticket tape running along the bottom saying they're talking bollocks. Look at the world burning.
Yeah, one of the things about this is how blind to the outside world a lot of the optics are, because you can probably do this around March or April or around September, October and say, look, climate hasn't changed that much. But saying in the middle of December when it's 15, 20 degrees, it's, the planet isn't hotting up, or saying in the middle of summer, oh, no, there's no sign here.
Yasmeen, data shows that we're lagging way behind the rest of the world. It has to be said after a strong start, but then investment into renewables dropped right off. Looking modern, lithe, dynamic was the key part of the post-Brexit plan. Is there money to be made by going the other way and joining a sort of more aggressive group of countries?
If you're
doing
Theresa
business with
Villiers,
them?
then yes. Of course, referencing those Shell stakes that she had when she was, let me check my notes, environmental secretary.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Well, she didn't know about, apparently. Again,
Yeah.
like Rishi Sunak and his wife's stake in the childcare company. Their excuse seems to be, we're so fucking rich, we have no idea what investments we have. As if we'll make the public go, oh, they're like me.
Yeah, same. I mean, the government obviously announced that they would approve 100 oil and gas licenses recently. And I don't know, I mean, my understanding of so that's clearly pivoting the other way.
Yeah.
And it's something that environmental campaigners, to Seth's point, have called short-sighted, selfish. And you only really have to look around at what's happening in Greece. It's what's happening in Hawaii to see the short-sightedness of it. Even though, yes, it's raining in the UK right now, that doesn't mean, I think it's allowed us almost to be a little ignorant to the fact that continental Europe has been suffering extremely hot summers, and we're just kind of complaining because it's raining, which I, by comparison, just took as a blessing. But yeah, I mean, it's their whole message is that this is reliable and accessible and crucially cheap energy, and I think that's a much easier sell if you're this conservative government in a period of cost of living and inflation that we're experiencing right now, than to say we're going to responsibly, invest in our future and invest in renewable energy. So I think that's probably where the sort of cognitive dissonance lies. But quite aside from disappointing, many Brits, I would imagine it also wouldn't necessarily make Sunak and Britain look all that great among Britain's immediate allies. I mean, which isn't to say that, other countries aren't doing, amazing things on climate, that they're much better, but certainly in renewable investment, I imagine they are. And yeah, I mean, next meeting he has with Biden, I would find that very difficult. I would imagine that would come up. I mean, hell, I would imagine his next.
I think it will come up.
I mean, I would imagine his next audience with the king, it would probably come up as well. I'd be like, what are you doing? So it'll make for, I think some awkwardness.
Ed, this week, as I said, is NHS week, which if it goes anything like Boats week, fills me with dread. This is another area in which government is seen to be failing. So what's the rationale? We started day one of NHS week, doctors are on strike, and cancer targets are being dropped because we can never achieve them. So what's going on, genuinely? What's happening? I saw two journalists on Sky sort of reviewing the day's news, and they were both at a loss. The former Tory SPAD and the sort of more progressive commentator were both suggesting that basically Number 10 is clueless.
Yeah, I think if you're doing this series of weeks, you do kind of have to throw the public a bone and say, okay, well, this is one of your priorities, so we kind of just have to eat it. We have to just take our medicine and pretend we are going to sort out.
But why?
Something.
It's not like someone else was going to raise it. It's not like I was going to come along and make it NHS week or Boats week.
Yeah, I think it is or maybe they just ran out of ideas. There was nothing. All their other weeks were too nuts. We're trying to get rid of Devolution Week or something like that. I don't know.
I love the fact that Sunak started with Tech Week and then legged it to California. It's
what do you think is?
What are you doing? What week are you doing? I'm doing Tech Week.
But do you think it's a case of the cat's away so the mice can play? Because Rishi Sunak got to do his Tech Week, then jet off to California for his holiday, and then all the more kind of mental figures within the Conservative Party were like, well, we're going to do our small boats week now. And so, yeah, it is bad politics, I guess, but they have to have 1 week.
Yeah.
Maybe if you're having four or 5 weeks, one of them probably should be the NHS. It's just dreadful politics. Is it just they're complete gluttons for punishment, or is it all like, or we get all the criticism of the NHS and confine it to 1 week?
Yeah, because it's going to go away.
And then
People who
Quick
are
and
waiting for
painless,
another
yeah.
operation will forget. They'll go, oh no, that it's not NHS week. I'd like to be angry about it.
There's always next
but
year.
it's not it's not the right week for it. I have to wait till August next year.
Remember, the important thing here is that Sunak does have a very, very nice beachfront house in California, and Tech Week's a fabulous excuse to go there.
Absolutely. I think also as well is part of it. It's not news that the NHS is in a dire state. It's one of it's been crap for however long, and everyone complains about it. So there's all the criticism about the NHS under this government, or the government since 2010. It's nothing. If it's like death by 1,000 cuts, nothing's going to stick. Nothing's good. Nothing about the NHS is going to tank this government.
Seth, as proof of that, the deficit in the aggregate polling between Labour and the Tories actually increased by 1 point during Energy Week, and another 1 point during Boats Week. Does there come a point when Sunak might feel it's time to cut his losses and go to an election earlier than anticipated? Or a point when the party moves against him? It only takes 50-odd letters.
Politicians are not as heavily in control of their destiny as they like to think that they are.
Okay.
And so an acceptance of that, an acceptance of the Norman Lamont point of being in office but not in power, means that actually you might be better off just shutting up in some of these cases. Or indeed, if you're finding that your campaigning is counterproductive, and there have been cases of this in the past, you're better off not campaigning and just getting on. Remember, the ultimate calculation that every incumbent government makes is they hope that the policy-making cycle and the economic cycle will coincide with the electoral cycle, and that there'll be some amazing dividend in the 6 months running up to an election. But right now, the cupboard of policies is pretty bare, and the government seems to be better off just trying to get back to work and delivering stuff. Now, there's no real sign of this working, but unless you think that things are going to get 1,000,000 times worse as 2024 gets along, then...
You see, the problem is that that's a rational calculation, and fear rather dissolves that kind of rational calculation. So what I'm saying, I guess, is that what differential do MPs come back in September, or if they have like a really bad conference this year, and at that point Sunak has had a year, and they think maybe there's a year to go before the next election, or maybe even a little bit more, at what point do 40, 50 people begin to think maybe we just have to throw the dice?
It's possible, but given that they went through 3 prime ministers in 2022 and their poll rating only got worse, and it got decisively worse after Truss and hasn't really recovered significantly since then, I think that greed trumps fear. And greed suggests that backbenchers are on 85k a year and ministers are on 130k a year, and they can string this out for nearly another 18 months.
That's disgusting. Right, next up, time to choose our hero and villain of the week. Who deserves this week's Palme d'Or, and who the face Palme d'Or? Seth, I'll start with you.
My hero this week is the great Grant Shapps for his utter shamelessness in doing what's basically a commercial for JCB. It's a very strange thing because it actually came up in his transparency disclosures, even though it's free advertising from them. They haven't apparently given any money directly to him. They have given vast sums of money to the Conservative Party. They are one of the largest donors in the history of the Conservative Party. And then he's disclosed some free travel and refreshments and entertainment while he was going out to do this commercial for them. And it really is, I mean, it's branded with JCB all over it. It's really not subtle. So quite how you can get a minister for hire like this, I don't know, but he's so generous. And he's really, practicing what he preaches.
It's not in his brief, though. Oh, no, wait, it is.
Yeah, it's not like there's a conflict
Again,
of
who's your
interest.
villain? So he's your hero for that, right?
He is my hero for his brass neck.
Okay.
I know listeners will be familiar with my borderline obsession with the travails of Rudy Giuliani. But in the last week, there have been some very interesting transparency disclosures, and some of the more eye-catching stuff around sexual harassment and sexual discrimination. But one of the really damning details is that the person suing him alleges that he coached her to lie to the FBI over the impeachment trial of Donald Trump, the first one over Ukraine. That is very serious. Given the existing investigations going on right now around obstruction of justice, I would be very surprised if law enforcement in the US hasn't already taken a keen interest in it.
And the 6 unnamed fellow indictees,
Yes.
I wonder if one of them is Rudy. Yasmeen, how about you?
So my my hero of the week is England's women's team, because I talked a big game before the World Cup started about how the US was going to win for the 3rd time and it would be historic and it'd be amazing. And then obviously I jinxed us, so they got sent out quite early. But England beat Colombia on Saturday in what was a very good match, and so they're my only hope left, basically. So they're my heroes. And as for
Pandering for votes, I like it.
basically, yeah. And as for villains, to be honest, I've been away for a week and just completely switched off. So this might be a bit dated, but I'm still kind of haunted by Matt Hancock's Ken video. It kind of ruined. One of my favorite things about the Barbie movie was all the memes, all the delicious memes that it served on the internet. I thought some people did some really creative things with it. And then I saw that, and it's just going to ruin them all for me.
He just poisoned them all, didn't he?
Like I've had enough now, so I'm done. Anyway, so yeah, he's my villain.
Okay, what about you, Ed?
Yeah, mine's slightly different, football related still. I'm of course Scottish, so I'm very anti-England sport in every fashion, regardless of gender. So I've been discussing whether it's more sexist to support or to not support the Lionesses. So my hero is actually an unnamed Newcastle fan who, as Harvey Barnes celebrated his goal against Aston Villa on Saturday, Harvey Barnes does this arrow firing celebration.
Yeah.
And this Newcastle fan mimed catching the arrow and firing it back with such grace and poise that I thought it went very viral yesterday until the rights holders claimed it. So it was available to watch in the official highlights. I'm pretty sure just this like old bald man from Newcastle just doing like a mime show for everyone's specifically for Harvey Barnes.
I'm going to go look it up. And your villain?
Maybe a default answer at this point, but I think Lee Anderson and his comments about asylum seekers should, I think we should just always be wary of what he said. Although we are oversaturated by hateful statements about asylum seekers, it's good to kind of point them out and just say how atrocious they actually are.
Yeah, really, we could do a special prize for Lee every week, couldn't we? But I have made my decision. I have to give it to the Lionesses because when this comes out, they'll actually be playing. So come on. And we'll be lynched if we don't. So yes to the Lionesses for Heroes of the Week. And I think I'm going to have to go with Rudy Giuliani, just because it's Rudy fucking Giuliani.
That's
I mean,
just about the only time he wins
anything.
Literally, his photo is now next to the word villain in the dictionary. So I couldn't go another way. Now, there are plenty of moments in recent politics that have made us want to run away like the Nope Badger. But what meme made you cringe so hard you folded in on yourself like an armadillo in denial? Michael Gove tweeting, "I said Transdem man copy," after Stormzy endorsed Labour? Was it Johnny Mercer asking someone whether they insinuated his wife was a prostitute on the Plymouth Herald comment section? Or something as simple as Dominic Raab winking at Angela Rayner? Can anything beat the classic Ed Balls? Are virals just fun, or can they genuinely influence politicians and politics? Ed, I have to come to you first, right? Because part of the PoliticsJOE model is precisely that repackaging of political news as potentially viral, edible bonbons. What's the secret to something cutting through? Do you have a pretty good idea when you're putting something out whether it will do it or not, as it were?
Yeah, I think kind of the secret, it sounds quite obvious, but the secret to creating content for social media is that there needs to be a shareable sentiment. It needs to make you angry or sad or make you laugh. There needs to be a reason that the person seeing it would retweet it or send it in a message or show it to a friend. And I think that in a lot of kind of social first content, that's missed slightly. I think maybe in the interest of balance, or in a lack of, or a case of like, oh, we've got this quite dry news report about a dog show, as I say, like a local news program, and they're like, oh, we've got this content, so we'll just put it on social, and then it doesn't do well because it's not that interesting to people. So I think there was a good example of this was an unnamed publisher made this post, and it was aimed at students: what to do if you support the strikes, and what to do if you don't support the strikes. And that was on the same post on Instagram, and no one would share that regardless of your opinion, because why would you want to give someone information about your opposing view? I think that's it's emotion drives social sentiment. I think, or emotion drives sharing stuff on social media. I think that's the cut.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, can it be overdone? Like, can you... I remember a time when I got slightly jaded by the sort of, oh my God, this is the funniest thing you will ever see. And it's like, well, how many funniest things I will ever see can I see in a week? So is there a balance to be struck, or do you have to go for it every time? Like, you know, I'm so angry.
Yeah, I think there is people do react to the language that you use, and people do criticize kind of the emotive. It is a balance between, you want people to watch the video, but you also don't want to mislead them and say. So you use like emotive language, like Lindsay Hoyle rages at the government because he's angry. So it might be a slight exaggeration in some, but it's you need to. There is a balance to be struck, and I think people, if they see something if you've fabricated the sentiment, or people just think you're trying to get one over on them, I think there is the negative reaction as well.
Has social media, do you think, in a way, radicalized? And I use the word in its mildest sort of vanilla context, certain MPs. What I mean is, do some MPs now deliberately reach for the short, sharp thing that they think might become a viral little video, because they do attack each other on that basis? I've seen loads of MPs going, oh, well done, well, you got your Twitter video for the day. And so they must be aware of it, right?
Yeah, I think there is. I think quite often we see people do something stunty in the comments, and we think, that was for us. that was for us. For example, Dawn Butler, when she was chucked out the Commons for calling Boris Johnson a liar, regardless of like her, she was right. She was right to do it, but at the back of her mind, she would have been thinking, "This is going to be clipped. I'm going to get some press for this." And I think, but then conversely, some of our best clips are just MPs being very good at their job. Like Darren Jones in select committees, he's kind of made a name for himself by holding big business chairs to account, and we've got like compilations on YouTube of hundreds of thousands of views of Darren Jones just being thorough and good at his job. Yvette Cooper as well, when she goes up against Braverman. There's something to be said about a lot of the good content isn't overly performative, or like, because some MPs do DM PoliticsJOE on Twitter with a link to their speech, and you think that is the most boring thing I've ever seen in your life. But I also think there's when MPs kind of do or clip their own stuff, they kind of forget they're no longer in control of the narrative of it, because there is that in the social element of it. People can reply, "You're a dickhead," and they don't like that. And so I think that they forget about the kind of the two-way element of it.
Seth, have politicians not always done that in a way? Aren't memes simply today's headlines? Wouldn't Churchill be sort of eminently memeable if he were around today?
Yes, and Churchill's a really good example of that, actually, because he actively cultivated and thought about his image. I mean, there are stories about him going off to make a speech and grabbing his cigar and his hat and saying, "Mustn't forget my props." You know, Churchill used to smoke about 15 to 20 cigars a day, but he never smoked them for more than 2 or 3 minutes because he was very conscious of what he called being seen with a comically short cigar. So he was always being seen lighting up cigars, but he'd never actually smoked the whole
Oh,
thing.
that's hilarious.
And indeed, when he was being painted, he said to an artist, which are you going to do today, the bulldog or the cherub? He was very, very conscious of how that goes. And this goes really right back to, I think, the late 18th century. You start with someone like James Gillray, you move on to artists like Cruikshank and Rowlandson. They're caricaturing, and they're being relentless in their caricatures of politicians. But that has stayed with us. And if you think about particularly the prime ministers in history who come to mind, Pitt the Younger, Disraeli, Gladstone, Macmillan, Thatcher, they're all a gift to cartoonists. They really are. And they play that up to a certain element.
Yeah.
You mentioned Dawn Butler earlier, and actually the master of that kind of thing was Dennis Skinner, with his parliamentary office and things. He wasn't thinking in terms of memes, but he certainly was thinking, I'm building up a record of, raging in the corner and being angry about this. And we now have those compilation videos on YouTube of all the things where once a year on the Queen's speech, Dennis Skinner would say something pithy and short, which would make the evening news. So politicians do think in visual terms, and cartoonists can say things in visual terms. Not always good, it has to be said, but they can say things in that. And one really interesting point on this, actually, is how politicians have tried to control a lot of this, because we often overlook that the legislation from 1988, which allows them to televise Parliament, has very strict restrictions in place banning the use of parliamentary footage to this day for satirical or comedy purposes. And that is why you'll see politicians made fun of outside of the chamber. And I can think of loads of ridiculous things that have gone on in a chamber in full view of the cameras, and you never see that being mocked because it's still a criminal offence to do that.
Interesting. On what you said, social media has been around now for just over 2 decades. Are they training them a lot better? Because, despite the occasional gaffes, they seem to me to be more regimented than in the early days of Wild West social media, where loads of them got into trouble.
Yeah. It used to be the case that if you had a blog, you'd be someone like John Hemming or Tom Watson, who was considered a little bit geeky and a little bit weird, and also it would look really amateurish as a website. And those early cases really are almost a lesson in what not to do on the internet. Now, I think part of it is also, there's a tradition of buying brains in politics, but you also buy marketing and comms people to actually run these accounts for you. It's not always that slick, though, and it ultimately depends on whether the politician has enough sense to use it well. I'll give you one example, actually, which is when Rory Stewart was running for Mayor of London. He did his whole Rory Walks hashtag thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was quite good. It was interesting stuff about politicians connecting with people they don't normally connect with. But
a lot of it,
yes. Well, I was thinking
was
specifically
very easy to take the piss.
The thing where he's on the corner of Liverpool Street and he says, I met her a couple of minor gangsters. They weren't minor. There was nothing criminal. He was talking to 2 black men in Liverpool Street, and there was nothing remotely criminal about either of them.
Yasmeen, Labour's social media in the Corbyn years seemed a lot more switched on, actually. And I wonder, do you think that is a conscious choice? Has Starmer decided a more po-faced approach to online was the way to go because sort of seriousness and not getting involved with that stuff is sort of his thing?
I think that's part of it. I feel like he still has that prosecutor persona, very serious. And I think if you think back to who the average Corbyn supporter was, I don't have the numbers, but I think like visually, you think of a lot of young people. I think Corbyn did tap into kind of like a very young sort of base. And where are young people? They're online. And Corbyn generally just seemed a bit more, not wearing a tie, a bit more approachable, a bit like, it didn't come off as too forced, I think, when he would do something like that. Whereas Starmer, when Time had our conversation with him in February, he told me very plainly, where I'm trying to appeal to people who didn't vote for us the last time. Now, if that's, older people who perhaps aren't online or on Facebook only, who live in the red wall, then, maybe you don't need to be quite as internet savvy as that. But also, I think fundamentally to your point, it's just because he and Sunak, I think, are both kind of quite serious. Like, I couldn't see either of them trying to
But Sunak is very sort of Vanity Fair little videos. He
I was thinking of the boots.
He definitely has an online marketing
That's true.
thing going on, but it seems to also backfire quite a lot with him. Like, people watch it and they think, I don't want to see that. I don't buy this stuff of you in the, on a beach in the sunset with your golden retriever. It's a lie.
Yeah, and I think that's perhaps part of the reason that we don't see Starmer doing that as much. I remember for the profile speaking to some friends of his who said that he can't really pretend to be something he's not.
Yeah.
And I think that's perhaps why we're not seeing that side of him, because he just can't force it. And yet, does that make him perhaps less visible online? Yes, but does it also mean that people aren't making fun of his shoes or his trousers? I think someone was making fun of Sunak on Twitter, his tailoring.
Yeah.
Also true.
I mean, it's interesting, just chatting to you right now, it occurs to me that Sunak's presentational style, especially when it comes to that kind of video, is quite American.
Yes.
For an English audience.
That's actually quite true. Yeah.
So maybe there's something cultural with him having been out there and worked out there and having an eye to going back out there.
We'll see him kissing
in a couple of
babies
years.
and eating fried food at fairs before long.
Have there been campaigns specifically for social media that have really stuck, that you look at and think, this is how to do it?
The only thing that really springs to mind, and maybe this is quite damning, is the post that Labour did, which said that Rishi Sunak doesn't think paedophiles should go to prison. Because it was so shocking. Because it's also
interesting.
Untrue. I think Rishi Sunak thinks paedophiles should be in prison. I think there is this... So there's a lot of focus in social media campaign, and there will be a lot of brain power and planning going into how will we create this slate of content ahead of the next election. But the problem with online content as opposed to, say, a party political broadcast is you are competing against literally every other bit of content on the internet. So stuff, expressly political party stuff on YouTube does really badly because why would you watch that and not, I don't know, Mr. Beast or something like that? YouTube wants you to watch Mr. Beast. They don't want you to watch the Green Party's election videos. I think it is, it's hard to do well, especially from a really managerial point of view. I think the kind of more organic content would do well. But if you look at the one thing that Labour keep trying to do with Starmer is talk about him supporting Arsenal, and he gets rinsed every time which is bizarre because he's an Arsenal season ticket holder. Yet he supports Arsenal all his life. It's probably the most authentic thing about him. The one thing that most people in this country can relate to, and everyone just takes the piss out of him for it. So I think it's very hard. It's very hard to do. I think it's but unfortunately is the way to reach young people, because young people won't watch linear television, so they won't see this part of the political broadcast.
Can I wrap it up by asking you a question and then opening to the two of you, because I would like to know what you think as well. Is the influence of social media and politics on the rise or on the wane, do you think, Ed? Are parties gearing up for a primarily online campaign like last one, next autumn, or returning to more traditional grassroots bit of door knocking with a sort of side element in online? Because I vacillate between the two. Sometimes I think online is going to be huge, and other times I look at the by-elections and I think what actually worked was people on the ground sort of making people go and vote.
I suppose also as well, in line with people door knocking, etc., there would have been targeted ads on Facebook that would have been geolocated to the people who could have voted in those by-elections. I think the two things go hand in hand. I think the online stuff will be kind of the national story of the general election, and the door knocking stuff is much more about local issues. I went to Lee Anderson's constituency it was around the time he was making comments about the death penalty, and people I spoke to, because we were just asking about the death penalty, and quite a lot of people were like, I don't really care what you said about the death penalty. Do you know what I care about? This cycling path that the council have wasted money on. That's all people wanted to talk about. It was actually quite funny. I can't remember the figure, but say they spent thousands of pounds on a cycle path that went round Ashfield And multiple people told me they were like, I've not seen a single cyclist on it. And so their MP was advocating for the return of the death penalty, and that was what people online were talking about. But the much more salient issue, the election will be won by people on NHS waiting lists, people.
By anyone who promises to give the death penalty to cyclists, from the sounds of
I actually
things
think I think
they'd go.
That
Yep.
would be
Yes,
a real vote winner for the British
Let's not give them any ideas.
What do you think, Seth?
What cuts through is spontaneity, and
Yes.
that doesn't matter about the medium. So 2017 was a really good election to highlight the differences because the Corbynista sort of memes were spontaneous. They were, user generated. They were amateurish, but actually they made a real. They made a real asset out of that. The Tories, on the other hand, in 2017 had these amazingly technically brilliant adverts where you have Theresa May giving you the national message, strong and stable leadership, and then 30 seconds of her naming the candidate, which you cut to. And it looked terrible because she looked exhausted. She'd named 650 candidates, one after the other. She spent the whole afternoon doing this, clearly. And however technically brilliant it was, it didn't work. By 2019, the Tories had really caught up. They'd gone through an agency that made these things look a little bit more spontaneous and a little bit better. But the last thing on this is I think we hugely overrate the importance of what happens in the election. Only 3 to 5% of votes actually change during a general election campaign. Most of the change happens now between elections. And so what's going on right now in the next 12, 18 months, that's going to shift ground.
What about you, Yasmeen? Especially with a little eye over the Atlantic as well.
Yeah, I mean, I still think I'm inclined to agree with Ed on the point that I think for local issues, having that in-person touch helps. But I think for so many people, and I think this is particularly true in the US, it's not just that you have to meet people where they're at. And in a big national election like a US presidential, a lot of people are online. And it's not just where people's friends are. It's also in the case of a lot of people, and I'm thinking of a lot of people, particularly, I know that this may be true in other cases, but I know that this has been documented among Trump supporters. That's where their community is. Like, that's where their like-minded people are. So if you don't have a close-knit community, but you find it online, that's where you're going to be. That's where you're going to be discussing issues. So I think for better or worse, you have to be online. That has to be where a discussion is happening. So whilst it's true that social media can be an echo chamber, and whilst it's true that Twitter, thank heavens, is not real life, I do think that these things do influence. They do have an effect on real life. So I fully expect, at least with regard to the U.S. Election coming up, that we're going to be seeing a lot happening in the internet.
We've reached the end of the show, so it's time for escape routes. When we're not scrolling Hansard with our head in our hands, what are we doing to get away from the world of politics? Seth, let me start with you.
Can I just pay a tribute at this time of year to straw hats?
Okay. Is that it?
Yeah.
Just straw hats.
Glorious. Just lack of heat. Yes.
I think this is one of the best escape routes we've had. It's
Simple to the
practically
point.
performance art, I think, just straw hats.
It's also influenced by the temperature, I think, in this
Yep.
This recording studio. at
Buy
the
more
moment.
of them,
Huh?
wear them. How about you, Yasmeen?
So I recently read Curtis Sittenfield's not so recent novel Rodham, which is basically this sort of, it reimagines what would have happened if Hillary hadn't married Bill Clinton. It was kind of my first foray into a book that's like an alternative future, and I just love that genre.
fabulous,
It was so
isn't
good.
it?
I had to like consistently remind myself that it wasn't real because I find myself having like visceral hatred like towards Bill Clinton. But that's the only bit of spoiler you're
I
gonna
find
get.
that with a good fight because it follows the timeline of political events so closely.
Yes.
But then it kind of diverges and you have to remind yourself that, no, the PP tape was never seen.
It was like watching The Crown, where you're just constantly Googling. Like I was
Yeah.
reading and Googling, like
Did this
that
thing
interview
yeah.
happened. Yes.
Ed, how about you?
I would recommend watching How To with John Wilson on BBC iPlayer. It's this fascinating documentary series, which is essentially a monologue put to B-roll around New York City, and it each has the premise of how to make small talk.
Right.
And so it begins like, oh, you can speak to a New Yorker, but then they go, they meet someone and they follow that thread and they pull that thread and they go to pedophile hunters in Pennsylvania, and then they travel to Mexico. It's brilliant. It's executive produced by Nathan Fielder of Nathan For You fame. So I would highly recommend that.
Oh, sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
And it's not one I'd heard of. I've been enriching myself spiritually, I hasten to add. I don't play for money. I've been learning a bit of Omaha high-low poker. I am a very keen poker player, but usually Texas Hold'em. And I've been intrigued for a very long time about Omaha high-low. It's incredibly complicated because basically the pot splits in half, and the shittest hand can get half the pot.
Oh, wow.
And so the betting is incredibly complicated. And occasionally you can have a hand that is both fantastic and shit and win both halves of the pot. And it's been wonderful. I've been reading books about it and watching videos and playing with no money, just with sort of points or chips or whatever. And it's been brilliant. And that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? With, I think you will agree, a smorgasbord of suggestions to take forward. Thank you, Yasmeen.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Seth.
Thanks, Alex.
And thanks to our guest, Ed Campbell.
Thank you.
Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Friday or Thursday if you're a Patreon backer. I hope you are. Thanks for listening to Oh God, What Now? See you next time.